Let me ask you a little bit about the future, because you co-founded the NFT project Angry Teenagers. Great name, by the way, which plants trees and fights climate change, using the blockchain. Now, NFTs, in my eyes, appear to have gone from this exciting new trend to now, like, JPEGs of apes and that sort of thing. So it's cool to see you doing something unique and actually impactful in that space. But what are your thoughts on NFTs and I guess the future of the blockchain?
We started actually building around the Angry Teenagers before NFTs as digital artworks were a thing. So what we were interested by was that having a token that was non-fungible meant that we could solve what we perceived to be a very specific customer problem, which is this, that carbon credits have been a kind of business level solution to reaching net zero. But for individuals, basically there is no consumer market for buying carbon credits. And we felt that the reason for that was that there was a lack of trust, and there was a sort of perception you need a lot of expertise to understand where carbon credits come from, what they're doing, and therefore to judge between them. And we thought that if you could sell a token that was specifically geolocated to a particular piece of land where trees were growing, then you always had visibility of your piece of land that was generating your carbon credits, and you could see all the kind of research about that. But you could have a real connection to that piece of land. So we wanted to have tokens that could be tradable and sellable on a market, but that are non-fungible, and each one is uniquely linked to a piece of land. So that was where we started with non-fungible tokens. Then at some point during the journey, NFT came to mean something completely different that was sort of not particularly related to the idea of non-fungibility, but was just like a digital artwork. So that was kind of confusing moment where we were trying to sell something that was an NFT, but had nothing to do with digital art. I think what we learned, and through that project, we created this forest reforestation project in Ghana, 200-hectare project. There was a kind of pilot of this, and it geolocated a bunch of tokens to that. The thing that I really learned through that was that although it's true that individual consumers are not buying carbon credits and aren't taking action in the way that they could, theoretically there is a pool of capital that could be unlocked there to go into reforestation. What I really learned through the process was that's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck to mass scale reforestation, and particularly I'm talking in Africa and South America, those are the two places in the world. If you look in the Northern Hemisphere and China are more forested now than they were 100 years ago. We've dramatically increased. China has really dramatically increased forest cover in the last 100 years. But Sub-Saharan Africa, well, actually just Central Africa and South America is the problem. And those are the places that we need to change. But the problem is not money going in. The problem is people actually going out there and doing the work on the ground. And that is identifying the places, it's working with the communities, it's structuring a project with the communities in a way that benefits the communities locally, so that they will keep growing those forests and keep protecting those forests and not chop them down again in 10 years because they were chopped down because the near-term benefit for the local community was to chop the forest down. So if you plant another forest and don't solve that problem, the forest isn't going to stay there. So ultimately on that, the Angry Teenagers is like, it is still there, trees are still there, but it's not a project that I'm going to actively push into growing at the moment. We've spun out of that a company called 3 Trees that was run by the guys that were doing, that were doing the actual on-the-ground reforestation project in Ghana. They are now turning that into a mass-scale project. They've got tens of thousands of hectares under contract to reforest, and they are doing, and they've created both a technical and a community platform to do that, to unlock that at massive scale. And it's how you work with those local communities to be able to plant these forests in a way that they're going to stay around for a long time. So I think the future there is going to be more innovation in the actually planting, growing forests, working with communities to do that, and less so in the crypto space.
Yeah. I love the underlying fundamental technology of the blockchain and NFTs. I envision a world where every receipt is an NFT, every concert ticket is an NFT, rather than just focusing on JPEGs of, apes or something, right? Which is cool, but it's not quite the potential of the technology, as opposed to something like what you were doing in that example. Well, where did the name Angry Teenagers come from?
It actually came because it was what the genesis of actually started to do it was I went on. I took two of my two eldest daughters on a trip to Japan, where we were. I also where we were talking about all of these things one evening in the mountains. I'd also slightly weirdly forced both of them at aged 13 and 11 to read a book called The Ecology of Money. That is quite an obtuse regenerative economics book published in the late 90s by an economist called Richard Douthwaite. And his thesis there is that the value creation behind any major international currency, if you follow it back far enough, is based on extractive practices from the earth. So whether that's mining, whether it's oil, whether it's chopping down forests. And as international trade grows, that will grow further and will destroy more of the planet, unless we create, this is his theory, unless we create an international reserve currency based on carbon credits. And so the idea was that if, in order to do more international trade, you need to buy a currency that is only created when carbon is captured, then international trade is aligned with reducing carbon dioxide and with preserving the forests of the world and therefore biodiversity. So he was quite early, that was in 2000. I think he wrote in 94, actually. And so I'd forced my two daughters to read this. We were discussing that and kind of why isn't that happening? What gets in the way of that? And they were getting quite angry about the need for this, and as many younger generation are still. I feel, and I actually felt like I had been angry about this when I was a teenager, and at some point I just got used to it. I got used to the fact that the planet was completely f***ed and that I wasn't doing anything about it, and I was busy teaching people each other's languages. And although Memrise was very much a sort of mission-driven startup, I think that holiday with those two in Japan was a kind of turning point for me, where I felt that angry teenage energy. I wanted to reproduce that, and then it became a bit of an internal joke, and we created some artwork because that was NFTs. But that was really where the name came from.
Cool. Angry teenage Ben. I love it. As well as Web3, you love AI. I heard you obviously mentioned it earlier in the pod, but I heard this on a different episode you did on somebody else's show, where you were building neural networks as a teenager to try to predict the outcome of horse races. What are your thoughts on the future of artificial intelligence? Are we going to see AGI anytime soon? Is it going to be the end of the world? What are your thoughts on, I guess, the future of AI?
I can't pretend to be able to look that far. I can create a neural network to predict a horse race. Like, predicting the future of AI is a much trickier piece to do. But I guess I can look along the particular tracks where I'm working. I can peek a little bit further down the line there. And I guess within education, I think it's something that I'm excited about in education is that exams have been the kind of bane of education forever, I think. And within language education, we've got this preposterous situation where I can get an A in GCSE French, and I know that I can't have a conversation. Like, I know that I can't even do the basics. I could, when I lived in Beijing first, when I moved down from Qitiahar, where I wrote Black Dragon River, I was visited by some friends who'd studied Chinese at Oxford. And when they arrived, I had to help them get a taxi from the airport because they couldn't even talk to the taxi driver. And it's this sort of absurd breakdown. They'd passed exams, finals exams in Chinese at Oxford, and they couldn't tell a taxi driver how to get to a hotel. Preposterous. I think that that has been, if you think of why we have exams, why we structure exams as we do, it's really on the limiting factor of we've only got one human teacher or a small number of human teachers who need to be able to standardize marks across a whole load of students. So let's standardize the things that we ask them. Let's standardize the format of the response that we want to make it easy so we have a mark scheme. And all of that is channeling it into this sausage factory that is nothing like what we actually want to train people to be able to do. That we don't want people to be able to answer a mark scheme. We want them to be creative and solve problems of all different sorts. Now, what an AI, and I see things like AQA exam board where talking about testing using AI to moderate different examiners' marks that they were giving out. But that's like version 0.1. That's using AI to try and be slightly more efficient at doing the rubbish thing that we're doing already. What excites me is that we can now do a totally different kind of exams. On Memrise, we can already have students doing conversations in Spanish with an AI. And we can see how many mistakes they make. We can see whether their accent is good or bad. We can see how much grammar mistakes they're making. We can see how creative they are with their answers. All of those things we can right now just output. Yeah, that person is accurate and gets through the conversation, makes himself understood, but they're quite monosyllabic, very short answers, so not very exciting. To do that kind of exam without AI would require each teacher to be spending hours with each student. No one would set up that exam because it's impossible. But if we can examine like that, then it changes the way we teach. We no longer teach to see, can you answer a question on grammar structure? Because it doesn't matter. We teach you to be able to hold a 2-hour conversation in German because that's what you ultimately want to be able to do. And now that we can examine you on that skill and give a very standardized and accurate way of measuring, can you do that thing, that is totally scalable to millions of students, that changes how we can teach. And I think so you can see that in language learning, but I think you can see that across pretty much any industry, that the more we can create exams that are lifelike analogs of the real world and how someone is coping in those situations, the more we can align our teaching to being getting good at the actual thing we want you to do, rather than being good at the exam. And I think we know intuitively that being good at exams isn't the same as being good at the real job, and yet we persist in doing it. And the more we, the UK education system at the moment is so exam and test focused from such a young age that exams become, it's the sort of tail wagging the dog, that the whole education system becomes being good at exams. But then you get to the end, and like the person who's done A-level French and still can't speak, or done a degree in Chinese and still can't talk to a taxi driver. That's really obvious in languages, but I think it's equally true in every part of our education system. You learn to do maths, and you get to the end and find that you can still fuck up your finances, even though you know the maths of it. That's just ridiculous. It's because you haven't been taught to actually use the maths in the way that you need them in your daily life.
Okay. We've
I'm
talked
not sure
about
that I really answered your question.
no,
There,
no,
but,
no,
it's
no.
a good ramble.
I guess what I'm hearing, and correct me if I've misunderstood this, Ben, but through AI, we won't necessarily be taught what to think anymore, but we'll be hopefully taught how to think, because a lot of the what, you can put it into Google now and it'll give you the
Yeah.
answer already. However, if you can develop more frameworks and ways of tackling problems and leave all the boring stuff to the AI system to come up with, then it will allow us to have more, we'll be able to decide what to think or how to think rather than what to think. I'm rambling there, but does that make sense?
I think I agree with that. I think they're like pressing on a really interesting area. That another way that I think about this is that we've had several explosions in our ability as humans to access information. So for the Gutenberg press, which allowed the printed word to go to hugely more available, and then up to the internet, where suddenly information became 1,000,000 times more accessible. But weirdly, although the internet made information sort of 1,000,000 times more accessible, the actual amount of learning that people did, the amount of learning that changed their ability to do things on a daily basis, probably went up like 20-25%. An incremental improvement, but nothing like the access to the information. And I think there's this big step in an educational journey between the sort of conceptual learning and the internalizing that information in a way that it can actually change your life. Languages being a really clear example of this, where you can know and you can know the vocab, you can know the grammar rule, but actually being able to hear language and meaning appears in your mind, very different thing. And you need to go through that process. And it is that, it's a weird thing actually in language that, the way that we speak, that we talk about having language and then putting it into practice. We're doing learning and then putting it into practice. But actually, the practice bit is where we really learn to be able to do it. And this sort of dichotomy of learning and then practice. Practice is where we actually gain the ability. And I think what AI allows us to do is to take that explosion of access to information, and it gives us the tools to help people internalize that information much faster, much more effectively, and so create experiences that allow us to do really effective practice of using information, which is how we internalize it. And that's kind of talking to your point, but in a slightly different lens.
Let's bring this back a little bit to, I guess, business, because most people listening are entrepreneurs, are builders, are people trying to start stuff in technology. We talked about education for quite a bit there, and you're very well educated. You've got a master's degree in psychology from the University of Oxford. What type of mindset and psychology is required to be a successful entrepreneur? I appreciate that's probably not the type of psychology they were teaching you at Oxford, but as somebody who has also been to the University of Life many times, what I guess would you, if you were a professor of entrepreneurship and psychology, what mindset is important when people are trying to start something and build something amazing?
Yes, I have conflicting thoughts on this, because there's, on one level, there's an answer that is, you need the resilience and flexibility, that balance that I spoke about earlier, of holding a clear vision and inspiring people around that vision, but also being flexible to find the best way to get there and to listen to your customers. And there is a lot of resilience, because stuff is going to go wrong all the time. But I'm also kind of troubled by that, because as soon as you look for, or as soon as you define things like, I want these mindset traits in entrepreneurs, I believe, and in my experience, you are unintentionally skewing the kind of people that you're saying can be entrepreneurs, and broadly towards people that look like the people that you've seen being successful entrepreneurs, which is overwhelmingly white privileged men. Becoming less so, happily, but still to an unacceptably large degree, in my view.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've noticed, because I'm mainly about 70-30 70-80%, mentoring people who are from non-traditional founder backgrounds, again, very consciously. And one of the things that I notice is that although people need resilience, it's not quite a character trait. And I think we have a slightly lazy wish to make something and maybe it's to do with wanting people to be heroic, that we want to attribute things to being core parts of that person, and they are like this, and that makes them successful. And I feel there's a slightly more porous boundary between the person and their surroundings. And I think when mentoring people from non-traditional founder backgrounds, a lot of what I am doing is channeling. Okay, I think you can be bolder than that. I think you can be more aggressive, more ambitious. You can be more like an annoying white man like me, and more presumptuous. You can and you can channel a bit more of that. And actually, the resilience is often there internally. It's just that people are living in a world that doesn't show them that. It doesn't respond in the same way. And I slightly rambling answer, but I guess I feel as soon as we're starting to talk about what mentalities a person has, I start to feel a little bit uncomfortable, because I actually think it's a support network around everybody that is needed around everyone. And I think, I have my founder support networks where people who I speak to and have spoken to for years who are going through similar journeys, hugely important to me. A lot of those people that have been important to me over the years are people who look a lot like me, because that's what I find easiest to be supported by. But when you move into other founder groups, I think that having whatever works for each individual founder, having some way to be supported and feel like you are not alone on this journey, whatever that form that takes, is incredibly, incredibly powerful. So rather than looking at it as individual founder traits, I feel more comfortable thinking about it as, what are the support networks that founders need, and how can we help make those support networks a reality? And some of that support network is in mentoring and experience from people who've been through it before, who can say, yeah, no, don't worry, it always fails like that. that always breaks, don't worry. Yeah, this is cool. And some of that is just emotional support. Some of that is being given permission to behave in certain ways and say, no, it is perfectly reasonable to say your company is now worth. I have to say this a lot to people, not white men, but I have to say it a lot to people where it's like, you're going out to raise an angel round. It is perfectly reasonable for you to say, given where your company is now, that it's worth 2 million or 5 million or 10 million. That's perfectly reasonable. Go out and say it.
Yeah.
Own it. And if you're not coming from a social group where you're surrounded by other founders who are talking about what they're raising at, it's bonkers. You're like, I've just had this idea and I've started working on it and I've got a tiny bit of traction. How can I go and say to someone it's worth £2 million? It's insane. But you need to be given that permission to say, no, that is actually, it's perfectly reasonable to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as you have created something of real value. But